Something is being built in the shadows of the Middle East right now, and the rulers of Abu Dhabi are watching it happen with a cold, quiet terror they refuse to admit in public. In the span of just a few months, the two most powerful Muslim leaders on the planet, a Saudi crown prince who once bombed his own Gulf neighbor and a Turkish president who commands the second largest army in NATO, have sat down together and begun assembling something that has no precedent in the modern Islamic world. The analysts are calling it the Islamic NATO, and if it comes to full fruition, the United Arab Emirates, one of the wealthiest, most strategically positioned nations on earth, will wake up one morning to find itself completely encircled, diplomatically isolated, and strategically irrelevant in the very region. It spent 50 years and hundreds of billions of dollars trying to dominate. But here is what nobody is telling you. The real story is not just about a military alliance. It is about a fundamental rewriting of the Middle Eastern order, a power struggle that involves nuclear weapons, Israeli intelligence operations, competing visions for the future of Arab civilization, a collapsing Gulf unity project that was supposed to hold this region together, and at the very center of it all, a deeply personal rivalry between two men, Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, whose falling out may prove to be the most consequential geopolitical rupture of this entire decade. And before this video is done, you will understand exactly why the decisions being made in Riyadh and Ankara right now will directly affect your economy, your energy prices, and the balance of global power for the next generation. Stay with us, because this story goes far deeper than anyone in the mainstream media is reporting. To understand how Abu Dhabi ended up isolated, you have to go back to a single moment in September of 2025, when two men shook hands in a marble palace in Riyadh and quietly changed the trajectory of the entire Middle East. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif signed a document called the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, known by its initials as the SMDA. On the surface, it looked like a routine diplomatic formality between two Muslim nations that have always had close ties. Pakistan has provided soldiers to guard the Saudi royal family for decades. Saudi Arabia has bailed Pakistan out of economic collapse multiple times. This looked like simply formalizing what already existed. But buried inside that agreement was a clause that changed everything. It stated that any aggression against one member nation would be treated as an act of aggression against both. That is not a friendship treaty. That is an Article 5 clause. That is the same foundational language that binds the entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization together. The same language that compelled 29 NATO countries to invoke collective defense after the September 11th attacks. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan had just created the skeleton of a mutual defense pact with nuclear teeth, because Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state, and everyone in the room that day knew exactly what that meant. The implications were staggering and deliberately understated in the international press, because if the full significance had been reported clearly, the diplomatic earthquake it represented would have been impossible to manage quietly. But Mohammed bin Salman was not done. Within weeks of the Riyadh signing, Bloomberg reported something that sent shockwaves through every foreign ministry from Washington to Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi. Turkey was in advanced talks to join the SMDA, not exploratory talks, not preliminary conversations, advanced talks. Talks so far along that a draft accession text had already reportedly been prepared. And suddenly, what had looked like a bilateral defense arrangement between two Muslim allies transformed into something entirely different. Combine Saudi Arabia's financial resources and its unrivaled religious legitimacy as the custodian of Islam's two holiest sites, with Pakistan's operational nuclear capability and battle-hardened military, and Turkey's massive conventional armed forces, its NATO standard military training, its world-class drone warfare program developed domestically under the Bayraktar line, its expanding shipbuilding facilities, and its position as the alliance's second largest standing army. And what you get is a structure that analysts immediately began calling, with growing seriousness, an Islamic NATO. 3 nations, 3 completely complementary military capabilities, 1 collective defense clause, and 1 unmistakable strategic purpose. What was taking shape was the most significant realignment of Muslim world security architecture since the end of the Cold War. And it was taking shape not against Iran, not against Russia, and not even primarily against Israel. It was taking shape around a vision of Muslim strategic autonomy, and one of its most direct consequences was the complete strategic encirclement of the United Arab Emirates. Now, to understand why Abu Dhabi is the target, you need to understand the fault line that has been quietly cracking open beneath the surface of Gulf unity for the past several years. Because the story that the world has been told about Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that they are natural allies, brothers in Gulf solidarity, partners in Vision 2030 and regional stability, that story is almost entirely a carefully maintained fiction. The reality is that the relationship between Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed the man they call MBZ, the president of the UAE, has deteriorated from a mentor-protege partnership into something that now looks uncomfortably close to an open strategic rivalry. When MBS first rose to power as Deputy Crown Prince in 2015, he was by many accounts a protege of the older and more experienced MBZ. The UAE president, then 64 years old to MBS's 30, was seen as a seasoned operator who had navigated the complexities of Gulf politics for decades. He mentored the younger man, shared his strategic frameworks, helped shape his worldview. But protege relationships, in the world of autocratic politics, have a predictable trajectory. The student eventually concludes that he has nothing left to learn from the teacher. And worse, he begins to see the teacher as a competitor. According to Foreign Affairs, their personal relationship has degenerated in recent years into something more like a rivalry, with each leader seeing the other as insufficiently respectful, and their mutual jealousies feeding directly into the broader strategic contest between their countries. And in late 2025, that rivalry stopped being quiet. On December 30th, 2025, Saudi Arabia did something that would have been literally unthinkable 5 years ago. Saudi airstrikes hit the Yemeni port of Mukalla. Not Houthi positions, not Iranian-backed infrastructure. Saudi bombers struck a weapons shipment that was being delivered to a UAE-backed separatist group called the Southern Transitional Council. Saudi Arabia bombed a proxy force that was being funded and armed by its closest Gulf neighbor, the United Arab Emirates. And then, in language that was unprecedented in the history of Gulf diplomacy, Saudi officials released public statements condemning the UAE for what they called highly dangerous behavior that constituted a direct threat to the kingdom's national security. These were not diplomatic whispers delivered through back channels. These were official accusations, put squarely on the record, directed at a country that Saudi Arabia had spent years treating as its closest regional partner. As the Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute concluded, even at the worst of Gulf tensions during the blockade of Qatar nearly a decade ago, Saudi Arabia had never directly bombed forces aligned with its neighbor. The crossing of that threshold in January 2026 signaled something profound. The old alliance was not just strained, it was broken. What had driven the relationship to this point? The answer lies in the diverging visions of two extraordinarily ambitious men pursuing fundamentally incompatible strategies for the same region. Mohammed bin Salman wants to position Saudi Arabia as the undisputed leader of the Arab and Muslim world. He wants territorial integrity, centralized state authority, and a regional order built around legitimate governments rather than proxy militias. He wants to be seen as the protector of Arab sovereignty, the defender of established borders, the man who holds the line against fragmentation and chaos. Mohammed bin Zayed, by contrast, has pursued what analysts now describe as a maritime empire strategy. Rather than building coalitions of states and working through established institutions, Abu Dhabi has spent years and tens of billions of dollars cultivating relationships with sub-state actors, separatist movements, paramilitary groups, and autonomous zones that answer to Abu Dhabi rather than to any recognized capital city. The UAE has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the port of Berbera in Somaliland, a breakaway territory not recognized as an independent state by a single member of the United Nations. It has backed the Southern Transitional Council in Yemen, a separatist force explicitly seeking to divide the country and hand the south to Abu Dhabi's strategic orbit. It has provided financial and military support to the rapid support forces in Sudan's devastating civil war, which has been described by the United Nations as one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in the world. And it has maintained increasingly warm ties with Israel, including a conspicuous refusal to condemn Israeli military operations that every other significant Arab nation has publicly denounced. These are not random policy choices. They are the carefully calibrated building blocks of a coherent Abu Dhabi grand strategy. The UAE wants a fragmented Middle East and a fragmented Horn of Africa, because in a fragmented region, a small but wealthy and strategically savvy nation like the UAE can punch far above its weight. If you control the ports, if you finance the militias, if you have relationships with the groups that control the coastlines and the shipping lanes, you do not need a large conventional army. You just need money, patience, and a will. Willingness to operate in the gray zones where larger powers are either reluctant or unable to go. For years, this strategy worked brilliantly, but Mohammed bin Salman watched it happening and began to see a deeply troubling pattern emerging from Abu Dhabi's accumulation of proxy relationships and fractured territories. From Riyadh's perspective, the UAE was not just pursuing its own interests. It was actively destabilizing the state-based order that Saudi Arabia needs to survive as a dominant regional power. Every separatist movement the UAE backed, every paramilitary it financed, every breakaway zone it legitimized, was a precedent that could one day be turned against Saudi Arabia itself. And when the Southern Transitional Council advanced to the edges of Saudi territory in late 2025, that theoretical concern became a concrete and immediate security threat. And then Israel made a move that crystallized the fault line in the most dramatic way possible. In December 2025, Israel formally recognized Somaliland's unilateral declaration of independence. Saudi Arabia responded with fury, joining scores of countries in condemning the recognition as a blatant violation of international law and African Union principles of territorial integrity. But one name was conspicuously, strikingly absent from that list of condemnations. The United Arab Emirates did not sign. Abu Dhabi refused to join the international statement, and analysts noted with growing alarm that, Israel's decision to recognize Somaliland appeared to be directly linked to plans for Israeli military and intelligence facilities in the territory, giving Tel Aviv an operational presence overlooking Houthi activity in Yemen and the entire strategically critical Red Sea corridor. The UAE, with its $440 million investment in Berbera port and its deep political alignment with the Hargeisa administration, appeared to have facilitated, or at minimum enabled, the very Israeli move that was inflaming the entire Arab and Muslim world. The European Council on Foreign Relations reported that Saudi Arabia concluded Israel was acting in coordination with the Emirates in this arena as well. In Riyadh, this was not interpreted as an oversight or an accident of diplomatic timing. It was interpreted as a declaration of which side Abu Dhabi had fundamentally chosen. And now we reach the dimension of this story that explains everything, and that is the Abraham Accords. In 2020, under enormous pressure from the Trump administration, the UAE became the first major Gulf Arab state to normalize relations with Israel in what was branded as a historic peace agreement. Mohammed bin Zayed was celebrated in Washington as a visionary statesman who had broken the Arab taboo on recognizing Israel. Billions of dollars in investment flows and technology partnerships followed immediately. Advanced American weapon systems were promised. And the Abraham Accords were held up as proof that pragmatic Arab leadership could transcend the Palestinian issue and embrace a new transactional regional order. But in Riyadh and in Ankara, and increasingly across the broader Muslim world, the Abraham Accords were never viewed as a peace agreement. They were viewed as a strategic transaction of the most cynical variety. Abu Dhabi got access to American military hardware, including a promise of advanced F-35 fighter jets, in exchange for providing Israel with something it had wanted for decades, which was Arab legitimacy, and most critically, a gateway into the Gulf region's financial and commercial ecosystem. After October 7th, 2023, and the subsequent war on Gaza, that alignment became a political liability that Abu Dhabi could no longer easily manage or explain to its Muslim neighbors. Saudi Arabia, still deeply invested in its own potential normalization deal with Israel, but insisting on meaningful progress on Palestinian statehood as a precondition, watched the UAE's accommodation of Israeli military operations with growing discomfort and then with open contempt. Saudi media outlets began explicitly accusing the UAE of acting as Israel's stooge in the wider region. And when the Islamic world needed Arab solidarity most urgently, Abu Dhabi consistently chose its Israeli and American relationships over its Arab and Muslim obligations. This is the full context, the deep, structural, years-long context, in which Mohammed bin Salman began quietly assembling the Islamic NATO. And this is where Erdogan enters the picture in a way that nobody fully anticipated. Because Turkey's potential inclusion in the Saudi-Pakistan SMDA is not just about military capability, it is about optics, about legitimacy, and about sending an unmistakable message to Washington, to Tel Aviv, and most critically to Abu Dhabi, that the new regional order is being written without them. Turkey under Erdogan has increasingly cast itself as the champion of the Palestinian cause, the defender of Muslim dignity, and the counterweight to what Ankara sees as an Israeli-American axis that operates without accountability across the Muslim world. But the genius of Turkey's position is more subtle than simple ideological solidarity. Erdogan is playing every side simultaneously. He condemned the US and Israeli military operations as violations of sovereignty. He called Iranian retaliatory strikes on Gulf states unacceptable. He is the indispensable bridge figure, too important to NATO to be dismissed by the West, and too vocal on Muslim causes to be dismissed by the Muslim world. This gives him a negotiating position of extraordinary leverage, and he is using it with considerable skill. For years, Turkey and the UAE had actually maintained a surprisingly warm economic relationship that most observers overlooked. Bilateral trade between Turkey and the UAE reached approximately $16 billion in 2024, roughly double Turkey's trade volume with Saudi Arabia during the same period. Emirati investments in Turkey topped $6 billion in cumulative terms. Between 2020 and 2024, the UAE was the single largest destination for Turkish arms exports, accounting for nearly 18% of Turkey's total overseas defense sales. Turkey and the UAE even renewed their bilateral currency swap agreement in 2025, providing a swap line of nearly $5 billion between their central banks. These are not the numbers of adversaries. These are the numbers of deeply integrated partners. And Abu Dhabi had every reason to believe that Turkey was its insurance policy against complete Saudi dominance of the region's strategic direction. But Erdogan is not choosing Abu Dhabi. He is choosing Riyadh, and the reason is simultaneously simple and profound. Mohammed bin Salman has something Erdogan wants desperately, which is direct, privileged, and seemingly effortless access to Donald Trump's White House. During Mohammed bin Salman's visit to Washington in late 2025, he was received with remarkable ceremony, and Trump reportedly pledged to sell Saudi Arabia advanced F-35 fighter jets and work toward a formal bilateral defense treaty between the two nations. Turkish officials have increasingly come to view Mohammed bin Salman as a regional actor with unique leverage over Washington, leverage that Ankara believes could help smooth Turkey's own persistently complicated relationship with the Trump administration. For Erdogan, joining or closely associating with the Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact is not primarily a military decision at all. It is a political calculation of the highest order. It is a way to align himself with the man who is emerging as the most influential Muslim leader in the world in terms of White House access, economic firepower, and regional prestige. And it is simultaneously a signal to Washington and Brussels that Turkey has options, that its cooperation within NATO cannot be taken for granted, that Ankara's loyalty has a price. The effect of Turkey's reported pivot toward Riyadh has been immediate and devastating for Abu Dhabi in ways that extend far beyond diplomatic symbolism. The European Council on Foreign Relations documented that Saudi Arabia has been coordinating with Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan to restrict UAE activities across multiple theaters simultaneously. Egyptian airspace was reportedly being restricted for Emirati cargo flights, suspected of supplying the RSF. In Sudan, Saudi Arabia brokered the transfer of Pakistani fighter jets to the Sudanese armed forces, putting Chinese-Pakistani military technology directly into the hands of the faction fighting against Abu Dhabi's preferred actor in Sudan. Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan visited Cairo in January 2026 to secure Egyptian rhetorical support on Yemen and to initiate joint Saudi-Egyptian efforts to constrain Emirati logistics networks. And coordinated pressure was applied on Libyan military strongman Khalifa Haftar to disrupt smuggling routes used by the UAE to support the RSF, including through the temporary closure of Libya's Al Kufra airport, a key logistical hub on the Sudan supply corridor. This is not rivalry. This is active, coordinated multi-theater containment. Saudi Arabia was simultaneously squeezing Abu Dhabi in Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, and the Horn of Africa, and doing so with the help of Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan acting in coordinated fashion. Imad Badi, a researcher and expert on armed groups in the region, told Middle East Eye that if this coalition against the UAE crystallizes, that represents an unprecedented geopolitical shift in how virtually the entire structure of Middle East power is organized. Now, look at what happened in each theater individually, because the pattern that emerges is devastating for Abu Dhabi's strategic position. In Yemen, the Southern Transitional Council staged a major military offensive in late 2025, seizing key territory across Hadramaut and Al-Mahra provinces. The move brought UAE-backed separatist forces uncomfortably close to Saudi territory. Riyadh responded not with diplomacy, but with airstrikes on what it described as Emirati weapon supply routes, killing 20 separatist fighters in strikes on January 2, 2026. Saudi-backed government forces launched a counteroffensive that pushed the STC back with remarkable speed. By early January 2026, the Southern Transitional Council had been dissolved as a recognized political entity. Abu Dhabi's primary instrument of power in Yemen, the organization it had funded, trained, armed, and politically championed for years, had been eliminated in a matter of weeks. Saudi Arabia had forced the UAE to announce a full withdrawal from Yemen. And the reason this was possible was precisely because the Islamic NATO framework gave Saudi Arabia the confidence and the strategic backing to act decisively against a former partner without fearing the consequences. In Sudan, the pattern repeated itself with different actors. Saudi Arabia backs the Sudanese armed forces and the internationally recognized central government in Khartoum. The UAE backs the Rapid Support Forces, which controls much of Sudan's informal gold trade and has relationships with Israel. Saudi Arabia was not merely competing with the UAE in Sudan. It was lobbying the White House directly against Emirati interests, with Mohammed bin Salman reportedly urging Trump during the November 2025 Washington visit to increase pressure on the UAE over its role in financing the RSF. Saudi Arabia was going around Abu Dhabi, over its head, directly to the America N president, and finding a receptive audience. This is the kind of defeat that cannot be undone by a press release or a diplomatic courtesy call. It is a fundamental loss of parity in the relationship with Washington. And then Somalia. Israel's recognition of Somaliland in December 2025 prompted the Somali government to take an extraordinary step that was directly aimed at Abu Dhabi. On January 12, 2026, the Somali cabinet announced the cancellation of all defense, security, and port operations deals with the UAE. Every single agreement terminated entirely. Somalia chose the Saudi vision of state sovereignty and established borders over Abu Dhabi's maritime empire strategy. And within weeks, Saudi Arabia had concluded its own defense cooperation agreement with Somalia, stepping directly into the operational and political space that the UAE had just been expelled from. Turkey, which had mediated a fragile deal between Somalia and Ethiopia in late 2024, added its diplomatic weight to the Saudi-Somalia alignment. The message could not have been more direct or more humiliating. Saudi Arabia was systematically replacing the UAE as the dominant external power in the Horn of Africa, theater by theater, deal by deal, with the active cooperation of Turkey and the passive acquiescence of the United States. Now we need to talk about the economic dimension of this story, because this is where it stops being a regional power competition and starts being a problem for every person on Earth who pays an energy bill, holds investments in global markets, or works in a business that depends on predictable commodity prices. Now, the UAE is not just a geopolitical actor, it is one of the world's most important financial nodes. Dubai handles vast volumes of global trade. Abu Dhabi Investment Authority manages one of the largest sovereign wealth funds on Earth, with assets estimated at over $1 trillion. The UAE's ports handle more container traffic than any other Gulf nation. Its airlines connect the world. Its financial system processes trillions of dollars in cross-border transactions annually. When a nation of this strategic and financial weight is being systematically isolated, the effects are not confined to the borders of the Arabian Peninsula. They ripple outward into global markets in ways that are slow-moving but ultimately decisive. Consider first the OPEC Plus dynamic. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been on opposite sides of oil production debates for years. As the Bloomsbury Institute noted, the UAE resents Saudi-led production cuts that constrain its output, viewing them as mechanisms for preserving Riyadh's dominance. In 2021, Abu Dhabi threatened to exit the OPEC Plus cartel entirely over quota disputes, and tensions over production levels have persisted ever since. In a world where Saudi Arabia is building an alternative security architecture that excludes the UAE, the ability to maintain the disciplined production agreements that OPEC Plus depends on becomes significantly more complicated. Both nations have financial incentives to produce oil, but Saudi Arabia now has additional political incentives to use production decisions as leverage against Abu Dhabi. When oil production decisions become entangled with an active geopolitical rivalry between the two largest Gulf producers, energy markets lose one of their most fundamental stabilizing assumptions, which is that Saudi Arabia and the UAE will coordinate rather than compete. And when that assumption breaks down, volatility follows. And when energy volatility rises, inflation follows. And inflation is the tax that every consumer on Earth pays when the men in Gulf palaces cannot agree on how to manage their rivalry. The competition in the financial services sector is equally significant and equally underappreciated. Saudi Arabia has demanded that international companies seeking to do business in the kingdom relocate their regional headquarters from Dubai to Riyadh. This initiative, known as Saudi Project HQ, is a direct assault on Dubai's three-decade dominance as the Middle East's premier business hub. And the initiative is working. Dozens of multinational corporations have already relocated their Middle East headquarters to Riyadh, drawn by the size of the Saudi market, the scale of Vision 2030 contracts, and the implicit message that a company without a Riyadh headquarters will find itself at a disadvantage when competing for Saudi government business. For Dubai, this is not merely a competitive inconvenience. It is an existential challenge to the identity that the emirate has built its entire economic model around. Dubai branded itself as the region's neutral meeting point, the place where global capital connects with Gulf opportunity regardless of politics. But neutrality is hard to maintain. When your country is actively backing Israeli intelligence operations in the Red Sea, supporting separatist forces that have been bombed by your largest neighbor, and financing paramilitary groups condemned by the United Nations, while your neighbor lobbies the White House to apply pressure against you. The technology competition adds another layer to this strategic contest. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are racing to attract global technology companies, artificial intelligence investment, and semiconductor manufacturing capabilities. Both are investing massively in AI, infrastructure, cloud computing facilities, and the data center capacity that the digital economy requires. The UAE has been ahead in this race for years, leveraging its more developed private sector ecosystem, its lower regulatory barriers, and its earlier investment in digital infrastructure. But Saudi Arabia is closing the gap with extraordinary speed. The scale of capital available through Saudi sovereign wealth funds and Vision 2030 commitments is beginning to overcome the UAE's head start. And the Islamic NATO alignment shifts the leverage calculus for technology companies making location decisions in the Gulf. A company choosing between a Riyadh headquarters and a Dubai headquarters is now also implicitly choosing between a Saudi strategic ecosystem backed by Pakistani nuclear deterrence and Turkish military capability, and an Emirati strategic ecosystem increasingly isolated from the dominant regional coalition. The political risk calculation that every serious technology company performs is now materially different from what it was 2 years ago. But the most consequential dimension of this story is the one that operates at the level of the global order rather than just regional competition. The Islamic NATO project, if it reaches maturity, does not just isolate Abu Dhabi. It fundamentally challenges the architecture of Western dominance in the Middle East that has been in place since the end of the Cold War. For 30 years, the United States has been the ultimate guarantor of Gulf security. American military bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia have been the bedrock of the regional order. American weapons, American intelligence, American diplomatic support, these have been the currency through which Gulf states purchased their security. And in exchange, the Gulf states produced oil on terms that suited the global economy, kept shipping lanes open, cooperated on counterterrorism, and maintained a broadly pro-Western alignment that Washington could count on. But that system has shown its cracks repeatedly and catastrophically. When Iranian drones struck Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq in 2019 and knocked out 5% of global oil supply in a single attack, Washington's response was muted to the point of embarrassment. The Gulf states felt they needed security guarantees most urgently, and America delivered words, not forces. The SMDA between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan was explicitly framed, as Chatham House analysts noted, as a response to precisely this American unreliability, emerging following American inaction on 2 separate occasions when Iran or Iranian-backed forces struck Saudi Arabia and elicited only mild condemnation from Washington. The Islamic NATO project is, at its core, a hedge against the United States. It is Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan saying collectively that they will not bet their national security on American reliability alone, not when Washington's strategic attention shifts with every election cycle, not when Israeli interests can override Gulf Arab interests in Washington's calculation, without meaningful consequence. Not when the world is moving toward multipolarity and the old American-dominated order is visibly fraying at its edges, and this has profound implications for NATO itself. Turkey is NATO's second-largest military force. If Ankara formalizes a collective defense relationship with Riyadh and Islamabad, Turkish obligations under that arrangement could create tensions with its NATO commitments that neither Ankara nor Brussels is fully prepared to manage. As Chatham House analysts observed, Turkey sees the opportunity provided by bridging East and West as not just securing the state, but demonstrating its independence, offering it leverage within each successive power bloc. This is strategic judo of the highest order, using the weight of the Western alliance's fear of losing Turkey to extract concessions from the very alliance Turkey is simultaneously threatening to partially defect from. For the United States, the calculus is genuinely uncomfortable in ways that no Washington think tank has fully resolved. Washington needs to keep Turkey inside NATO, because losing the Bosphorus control and the Incirlik air base would be strategically catastrophic for American power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East simultaneously. Washington also needs Saudi Arabia to cooperate on oil production, on regional stability, on counterterrorism, and on the potential Saudi-Israeli normalization that would be the crown jewel of American diplomatic achievement in the region. And Washington needs to maintain its relationship with Pakistan, a nuclear state that borders Afghanistan and China and Iran simultaneously, whose cooperation on intelligence and counterterrorism is genuinely non-negotiable for American security planners. But all 3 of those critical relationships are now being drawn into a single framework that is explicitly designed to reduce dependence on Washington. America is watching its 3 most important Muslim world partnerships converge into a bloc that uses American weapons and maintains American alliances, while simultaneously building the institutional architecture for operating without American permission. And here's the detail that will keep American strategic planners awake at night. Pakistan's nuclear weapons program was developed with significant Chinese assistance. Pakistan's most advanced fighter jet, the JF-17, is a joint Chinese-Pakistani development program. Reports indicated that Pakistan signed a $4 billion deal to sell 16 JF-17 fighters to Libya, and discussions were ongoing regarding a potential sale to Saudi Arabia itself, a country that America is simultaneously promising advanced F-35 fighters. If Saudi Arabia acquires both American F-35s and Chinese-Pakistani JF-17s, the technology compartmentalization that American defense planners consider essential to protecting sensitive avionics and stealth technology becomes extraordinarily difficult to maintain. And analysts noted Chinese intelligence networks, then the Islamic NATO's acquisition of American and NATO military technology through Turkey and Saudi Arabia creates a potential vector for Chinese intelligence access to Western military secrets that no administration can comfortably dismiss. All of this brings us back, full circle, to Abu Dhabi and the question of whether its isolation is permanent or recoverable, because the UAE is not without options. Turkey, despite its reported pivot toward Riyadh, still has $16 billion of bilateral trade with the UAE and billions in Emirati investments embedded in its financial system. Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan has been careful to maintain the language of ongoing partnership with Abu Dhabi, even while discussions with Riyadh proceed. And the UAE's Abraham Accords relationship with Israel, for all its political costs in the Muslim world, still gives Abu Dhabi access to Israeli intelligence, Israeli defense technology, and Israeli political relationships with Washington that have real strategic value. The CSIS analysis argued that the United States and Europe should be careful not to take a side in the Gulf rivalry, noting that the geography of both Saudi Arabia and the UAE affords them outsized influence over oil markets and critical trade routes, and that it is important to keep both countries oriented toward the West, rather than driving either into a different strategic orbit. Some Washington voices have even suggested that mending the MBS-MBZ relationship could require direct personal intervention, perhaps by Trump himself, given that personal dynamics between the two leaders are at least as important as the structural forces driving their rivalry. But the structural forces are extraordinarily powerful, and they are what the Institute for National Security Studies described in February 2026 as the fundamental reality of the new regional order. The rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the UAE is structural rather than episodic, they concluded, with both states consolidating influence through local partners and economic tools. The old alliance is not experiencing a temporary disruption. It is undergoing a fundamental transformation from which it cannot return to its previous form. There is one more layer to this story that deserves careful examination, because it connects the Islamic NATO project to something even larger than Gulf rivalry or Middle Eastern power politics. It connects it to the fundamental question of what the global order looks like in a world where American hegemony is no longer uncontested. And to understand that connection, you have to look at China, because China is the silent architect whose fingerprints are on every element of this realignment, even when Beijing's name never appears in the public announcements or the diplomatic communiques. China has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in the Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure that now connects Pakistan to the Gulf, that gives Beijing commercial presence in the very ports and corridors through which Gulf energy flows to Asia. China has provided the diplomatic mediation that restored relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2023, a deal that no American administration had managed to achieve despite decade terms. The Islamic NATO is, from this angle, also a mechanism through which Saudi Arabia is positioning itself for the post-American Middle East that everyone in the region can see approaching on the horizon, even if nobody in Washington is comfortable acknowledging it publicly. For Abu Dhabi, the China dimension adds yet another layer of strategic complication. The UAE has also cultivated deep relationships with China, hosting significant Chinese commercial infrastructure and processing enormous volumes of Chinese trade through its ports. But Abu Dhabi's simultaneous maintenance of its Abraham Accords, partnership with Israel, and its hosting of American military facilities creates a fundamental tension with Chinese strategic preferences that Saudi Arabia does not face to the same degree. China has been uncomfortable with the depth of Emirati-Israeli security cooperation in ways it has never had to be about Saudi-Israeli relations, because Saudi Arabia has consistently refused normalization with decisions being made right now by governments, corporations, and investors around the world. A European energy company deciding where to sign its next long-term LNG supply agreement has to factor in the possibility that the UAE and Saudi Arabia will continue competing rather than cooperating on production, introducing a new layer of supply uncertainty into contracts that are supposed to provide stability for decades. A global technology company deciding where to locate its Middle East Artificial Intelligence Research Center has to weigh the reputational and political risks of being seen as aligned with the UAE-Israel-America axis at a moment when the Saudi-Turkey. Pakistan axis is rapidly becoming the dominant political coalition of the Muslim world. A global shipping company routing its vessels through Gulf waters has to calculate the risk of operating in an environment where two competing Gulf powers are backing opposing proxy forces along the coastlines and choke points through which its ships must pass. These are not abstract concerns for think tank analysts. They are real operational calculations being made in real boardrooms right now, and the Islamic NATO Masterplan is the reason they are being made under conditions of greater uncertainty than at any point in the past 2 decades. Space over Libya's Al-Kufra airport, where Saudi and Egyptian pressure temporarily grounded the flights that Abu Dhabi was using to supply its chosen faction in Sudan's civil war. The Islamic NATO Masterplan is not just a geopolitical story, it is an economic story. Erdogan is not done. The SMDA has not yet achieved its full architecture. Turkey's formal accession, if it happens, will mark a threshold beyond which the Islamic NATO becomes something the West cannot ignore or manage through quiet diplomacy. Pakistan's deepening integration into the framework will add nuclear dimensions to every regional calculation that involves Muslim world security. And Saudi Arabia's parallel pursuit of American F-35s and a formal U.S. defense treaty, while simultaneously building the Islamic NATO structure, will test whether Washington is capable of managing the most complex alliance relationships in its history with the sophistication they require. The men in Abu Dhabi are watching all of this, calculating their options, looking for the opening that might allow them to break the encirclement before it becomes permanent. Whether they find that opening, whether the Islamic NATO project reaches the maturity its architects intend, and whether the global economy emerges from this realignment with its stability intact, those questions will define the Middle East and the world for the next decade. And you heard the full story here first. The master plan is in motion. The isolation is real. And for the rulers of Abu Dhabi, the most uncomfortable truth of all is that the man executing it is the same man who once looked to them for guidance. The man who learned everything he knows about ambition and strategy in the palaces of the UAE, and who has now turned every lesson he learned into a weapon pointed directly at the nation that taught him. That is the final and most devastating dimension of the Islamic NATO master plan, and that is why the story of how MBS and Erdogan just completely isolated Abu Dhabi is not just a geopolitical story for analysts and diplomats. It is the defining power story of our time.